All right, I think we can get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Audrey Bolus. I'm the Programs and Communications Associate at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, also known as TIMEUP. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our newest virtual panel, 11 Years on, the Path to Accountability in Syria. 11 years after Syrians took to the streets to protest for freedom and justice in the face of brutal state violence, the world has turned its eyes away from Syria. Despite this, Syrian survivors and victims have worked to carve out unprecedented channels for accountability for human rights abuses perpetrated by the regime and other actors, both inside and outside the courts. Yet, Assad's grip on power remains seemingly firm, and civilians inside the country continue to face arbitrary detention, surveillance, and state torture. Meanwhile, various actors are normalizing relations with the regime. Several states have reopened embassies in Damascus. Syria has been allowed back into the INTERPOL network, and some of its Arab neighbors are advocating for it to be welcomed back into the Arab League. Against this staggering backdrop of normalization, what prospects exist in the path toward accountability? Today, our panelists will discuss pathways for accountability in Syria, sharing their reflections on how the Assad regime and other perpetrators can be held responsible for their crimes, and considering the role of the international community in supporting Syrians' calls for justice. Before we begin, I just want to remind our audience that today's conversation is being recorded. You can follow along and live tweet with us using the hashtag TimeUpEvents. And as audience members, we of course invite you to submit questions using the Q&A function through Zoom at any point. Without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our TimeUp's managing director, the moderator for today's event, TimeUp's managing director and legal and judicial director, May Al-Sadani. May, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you to our audience and our panelists for joining us. As Audrey said earlier, this week marks 11 years since Syrians peacefully took to the streets to demand freedom and justice, only to be met with the brutal violence on the part of the Assad regime, later bolstered with support from Iran and Russia, in what would become one of the most catastrophic human rights and humanitarian crises of our time. The international community did not intervene in what I personally find to be a stain on our collective conscience, and what has arguably contributed to a culture of impunity, the impact of which we see in part in places like Ukraine today. Despite this, Syrian survivors and Syria advocates are working to carve out a path for accountability for the crimes committed by the Assad regime, the primary perpetrator at hand, but also others, armed actors, extremists, terrorists, and foreign powers. They have sought accountability in the courtrooms, which we'll discuss today, but also through other measures: memorialization, documentation, storytelling, fact-finding, and others. Today, I'm privileged to be joined by a panel of experts who are at the helm of these efforts and who I'll introduce briefly. Khulud Helmi, award-winning Syrian journalist and gender and media expert, as well as a member of Families for Freedom. Khulud is also the co-founder of Anab Baladi, an independent Syrian media organization. Layla Sibai, researcher and independent legal investigator on case files pertaining to war crimes and crimes against humanity in Syria. She is also a co-founder and board member of Huquqiyat, a membership-based organization of self-identifying women lawyers and legal practitioners who have a personal or professional engagement in legal accountability processes. Muaz Mustafa, executive director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force, which works on advocacy for Syrian victims, humanitarian initiatives, and the pursuit of justice and accountability for the regime's crimes. And last but not least, Fritz Streif, an atrocity and human rights lawyer with over 9 years of work in international criminal law, human rights law, and anti-corruption. He is also the founder of Branch 251 podcast, which covered the first ever Syrian torture trial heard in foreign courts. Without further ado, I'd like to jump into 2 rounds of moderated questions, which will then be followed by time for audience questions. To our audience, please do send those questions at any point in the conversation, and we'll get to them at this point. Khulud, I'd like to start with you. All too often, the conversation about accountability is one that gets buried in political interests. Sometimes it can get too technical. At times, it can get away from the root of the issue and from those affected most by it. Khulud, as we gather here on the 11th anniversary of the Syrian revolution, can you share with us your own story, why you decided to co-found Anab Baladi, and how it is you became an advocate for accountability for those affected by enforced disappearance?
Hi, May. Thank you very much. And hi, everyone listening. So the story of why I decided, I'll try to be very brief because it's a very long story. But then why I decided to co-found Anability in 2011 is that we have taken into the streets like in mid of March 2011, and then all the peaceful demonstrations happening, all the cities around Syria, like everyone, like almost everyone was demonstrating, and everyone was demanding change, democracy, fair elections, and the freedom of like freedoms of people and the press and everything. But unfortunately, we were faced by the brutal security forces in the street, and then the army joined in, and all these atrocities happened. But bit by bit, you started to realize that we have been cut. I mean, there was a cut between the cities. So the only means of communication or the only means of media was Al Jazeera. But then for those who have access, or like not only Al Jazeera, but Orient, BBC, and all these channels, but then it's mainly, most of them are in English, but those in Arabic, I mean, they cover the prime cities, let's say Homs, Daraa, and like other cities around, but they don't cover the details of it. It's just like people are protesting, but there are no details, no human flavor, if I may say so. And then most of the international journalists were not allowed access to Syria, where they were not granted visas to access the country. Those who smuggled themselves across the borders were targeted by the regime, such as Mary Colvin and others. But we decided that we have to bear the burden in a country where the media is state owned, and we have only the version of the regime in the TVs, like on TVs and the newspapers. So we are there, we're eyewitnesses. We can have access to my city, Daria, and other cities and towns around, like Damascus and Damascus countryside, and we have the ability to be connected to our colleagues in other provinces and cities because we have connections. So why not produce our own newspaper and tell our own story to the audience? So our main target audience was the locals, the Syrians themselves, because they were not able, they didn't have the luxury to have internet access and then see what is going on. So a printed paper could do them right. And then second, the international community, because everyone was like either romanticizing what is going on inside Syria or just denying or and not believing what is going on. So that was the reason behind that decision. And how I was involved in accountability is, in my city, we've seen a lot of atrocities. We have seen, I've seen my friends being detained from the demonstrations only because they protested against the regime. I've seen them disappear, and we were not able to either chase where they are, why they have been taken. There's no warrant. There are no notices for them or their parents to be abducted from streets and taken to cells. We've never known their whereabouts. And then I started to become personally involved with that when the earliest of my cousins started to become detained by the regime. Some of them were released, but then were taken back by the regime back to the detention center. But personally, my brother was detained by the regime in May 2012, where they came to my home and they searched the house at 12:30 a.m. and they arrested my brother. And since then, I feel that I personally have the right to search for my brother and others, of course. But then that is how I was willingly involved in the case of accountability to search and to have a voice, my voice for others, calling for the release of all detainees. But unfortunately, I was personally involved after May 2012, and I think that accountability is a cause of, for me, I mean, to pursue. And I hope that I have answered your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Khulud, and thank you for everything that you do. I know it's quite personal, but it's stories like these that really galvanize us to do more. Leila, I'm going to turn to you. I want to ask you, the magnitude of the crimes committed in Syria is immense, like Khulud is describing, and they're committed by actors who largely enjoy impunity. In the last few years, however, we have seen a number of cases involving these horrific crimes appear before foreign courts. How is it that these strategic case files are developed, and what successes have Syrian advocates paved the way for thus far inside the courts and while leveraging this concept of strategic litigation?
Thank you, May, and thank you, Khulud. It's always very humbling to speak with you and to listen to you. I'm going to answer this question in my capacity as a legal practitioner, as I currently do very little work in advocacy, but maybe someone else can pick up on that side of the conversation. I'll start by speaking a little bit about the context in which such cases are being developed. So most of the cases that you were referring to, May, are being developed under a legal principle that's called universal jurisdiction, which provides for states' jurisdiction over serious crimes against international law, such as war crimes, crimes against humanity, torture, or genocide, even when the crimes did not occur on that state's territory, and neither the victim nor the perpetrator is a national of the state. So in practice, it provides jurisdiction to open a case even when a state has none of the usual grounds for jurisdiction, such as nationality or territory, on the basis that such crimes harm the international community or international order itself, which individual states may then act to protect. There are a few important points to make here. So first of all, it's not a legal instrument that is implemented in all European countries. And even when it is, it's implemented differently in each country. So some countries will allow investigations in absentia, so when the perpetrator is not present on territory. Others will need the perpetrator to be present on the territory, and the specifics of the crimes, the modes of liability, double criminality requirements, temporal jurisdiction will differ in each country. It is, however, currently one of the only avenues to pursue criminal justice for the crimes committed in Syria, because Syria is not a state party to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, but also because of the Russian veto to refer the Syrian file to the ICC. So we're currently left with strategic litigation as the main instrument to pursue cases for international crimes. To clarify, the term strategic litigation normally involves selecting, developing, and bringing a case to court with the goal of creating a broader change in society. So cases are theoretically selected on the basis of their broader impact, since not all crimes can be brought to court. That leads us to the Al-Khatib trial, which ended this year in Koblenz, Germany, and constitutes the first trial worldwide on state torture in Syria. There were a few other significant milestones, such as the issuance of arrest warrants against high-level regime officials, a complaint submitted by the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression, the Syrian Archive, and a few other organizations on the use of chemical weapons by the regime. But I'm going to focus on the Al-Khatib trial for now. Because the question was about successes, I'll start by speaking about what I find positive about this trial and ongoing and upcoming similar cases, and then I'll speak about the associated challenges. So to me, there are three main aspects to the Al-Khatib trial. The first is that it does constitute a first step on a very, very long road to try and achieve some sort of justice for the oh so many horrendous crimes that were committed. And in that sense, it constitutes an attempt to put an end to the ongoing impunity, which most perpetrators have benefited from so far, enabled by the lack of political transition. So although it was said that the defendants were lower ranking than some of us would have hoped, and that the main defendant, Anwar Ra, defected in 2012, he was willingly engaged with the Syrian regime separatists. And as such, he did conduct and did order the systematic use of torture and sexual violence against detainees. He is someone's perpetrator, and his condemnation is someone's justice. And although it was the trial of one individual, Anwar Ra, but I am focusing on Anwar because of the relative importance of the case. But although it was a trial of Anwar Ra, the importance of the case also lies in his role as the head of the investigation division in one of the most important security branches in Syria, the Al-Khatib branch. So he was being persecuted for the crimes for which he was personally responsible, crimes that were either committed by himself or took place under his command. But the trial also enabled the German authorities to conduct a structured investigation into the systematic use of torture and detention by the Syrian regime security apparatus that goes beyond the specific branch at the specific time. This is important for one main reason. It enabled the court to rule on the regime's responsibility in the judgment, despite the case at hand being about one specific individual. That means that this case constitutes an important precedent which can be referred to in future legal proceedings. The judgment mentions multiple times that the crimes investigated took place as part of a widespread and systematic attack launched by the Syrian regime against a civilian population. This in turn speaks to the role of legal decisions in the writing of history and official narratives, which are especially important at a time when some countries are trying to normalize relations with the Assad regime and are taking active steps towards refugee return. The Al-Khatib trial also provided some space for much needed conversation within the Syrian diaspora on justice, impunity for such crimes, and whether and what kind of justice this specific trial constituted, and what could or should ideally have been done differently. So, for example, the fact that this specific trial took place in a German court with very little access to a Syrian audience, or that the fact that it targeted defendants which were present on the territory and may not have been considered a priority had there been any opportunity for meaningful Syrian-led justice proceedings to take place, which would have potentially have prioritized people higher up in the hierarchy over these defendants or affected their sentence. Maybe not, we'll never know, but I think it's also important to keep that in mind, since such cases are taking place in European courts. A majority have targeted members of non-state armed groups who are more likely to be present on European territory than high-ranking regime officials. Such cases may also constitute more of an investigative priority for national prosecution authorities and may be less challenging to conduct. And that's an important point because although the Al-Khatib trial and the current Ala Moussa trial constitute positive steps towards some justice for the crimes that were committed in Syria, the use of universal jurisdiction has multiple limiting factors which constrain the cases that can actually be brought to court and determine investigative priorities for both the NGOs involved in strategic litigation and prosecution authorities. First and foremost, national authorities have limited financial and human resources. They will only take on a limited number of cases which they will prioritize based on various factors, some of which are political. That means that the decision to pursue certain cases and not others is inherently political. Although German authorities and other European national authorities may be currently interested in pursuing such cases under universal jurisdiction, there's no guarantee that it will be the case a few years from now. These are all important points because it means that although some cases will be brought to court, a lot more won't. And although which cases are investigated and brought to court is highly dependent on prosecution authorities, it's also highly dependent on the civil society organizations doing the initial investigative work before the case is first submitted to prosecution authorities. Because of their reach and network, such organizations play a significant role in identifying and contacting witnesses. And such identification process then determines who gets to be involved in such proceedings. Unlike documentation, strategic litigation requires the identification of specific perpetrators who committed specific crimes. It's all in the specifics. So for that reason, it relies largely on working in partnership with direct witnesses. And that's something that I'll go back to later because it affects who gets to tell the story by affecting as well access to justice proceedings, which in turn affects which crimes are being considered and which survivors or victims are considered as such, which in turn affects political narratives and refugee recognition as worthy of protection or potentially eligible for refugee return.
Thank you, Laila, and thanks for kind of explaining why this litigation matters, even not just for lawyers, but for the grander scheme of things. And that's actually a nice segue. I want to bring you in, Muaz, into the conversation. What role do politics play in all of this? The decision for a German court to hear a case or US commitment to designate funding towards Syria accountability projects, or European leadership at the UN on Syria. None of this occurs in a vacuum. What has the advocacy looked like, the advocacy that's being done to pave the groundwork for accountability over the last 11 years?
Well, thank you, May, and I really want to thank Time App and you for inviting me, and I'm honored to be on this panel, and good to see friends like you and Fritz and others. And so I just wanted to say, unfortunately, and it shouldn't be this way, but politics is everything when it comes to this. Let's look at the German court itself, right? The road to Koblenz started with, and a lot of people deserve credit for this, especially Ambassador Stephen Rapp, the former U.S. war crimes ambassador, and who had to sort of have a lot of, amongst other advocates, political meetings with German authorities on the importance of accountability, because universal jurisdiction in Germany is based on the fact that would be of the interests of the German state, not just in general. And so even on that case, which has been really, I think, groundbreaking and important, it had political sort of backdrop that needed to be there. And the same applies everywhere. I mean, if you look at the United States, there are right now, thank God, some public, some not. So, at least 4 civil cases that have just come or coming through soon. But there are also you could say, sort of the contents of potential criminal cases as well. But in order for those to move, there also needs to be political will. And in addition to that as well, I mean, if you look at Congress, in Congress right now, we're working, to support alongside others, different bills that would increase the jurisdiction of the United States, also enable in terms of being able to go, after war criminals and so on. And in both those occasions, I think that's very important. Advocacy is important to make sure that these laws are changed. If you look at France, they released that guy who was arrested, with Anwar Rastan and Iyad early on in the Koblenz sort of investigation, because the interpretation by the High Court of a political law passed under, I think, Sarkozy, was that there isn't jurisdiction, and there needs to be advocacy there, and it will take probably like 2 years or so if it's fast, but to change that law and include that. So politics have been incredibly important in all of this, and at the same time, the accountability track, although it's about justice, is also very important politically. It means a lot when it comes to normalization. It means a lot when it comes to, it's the worst nightmare politically for the Assad regime. I mean, they believe they're disillusioned that there's some sort of rule of law state and so on. And having these court cases open puts a lot of obstacles on their mission of getting a military victory based on killing the Syrians and displacing them and detaining them, and then getting recognized again. So I think politics play a very important role in all of this.
Thank you, Maz. I'll come back to you because I think you introduced quite a lot of important things to keep in mind. But let me first turn to Fritz. Fritz, you created a podcast that was committed to unpacking what was happening in relation to the first ever Syrian state torture trial in foreign court, this trial that our audience has now heard time and time again, the Koblenz trial or the Al-Khatib trial. And this podcast was in part dedicated to ensuring that those most affected had the information they needed to be able to follow along. Why? And will you share with us this story and more about your experience? What did working on the Branch 251 podcast teach you about court-based justice and accountability for Syria?
Thank you so much, Leila. Thank you so much, May. Sorry, Leila, Khouloud, and Muaz, for having started the conversation. Thanks for the invitation. It's really an honor to be on this panel, and I think it's not just the 11th anniversary, but it's really timely. A lot of people are for a number of reasons losing sight of justice and accountability efforts for Syria in a time of what many call normalization, which of course is a term we should all reject because there's nothing normal about what's going on in Syria in the past 11 years and still now. We're just entering a new phase, really, a phase that is not less significant than where we're coming from. And so it's good and important to keep the conversation, the discussion, and these efforts alive, including through podcasts. We're preparing a new podcast now that the Koblenz trial has finished, which we're hoping to broadcast by the fall of this year. But let's take a step back, and I'm happy to answer your question about how this podcast idea actually came about. Everybody already sort of touched on this, and you just mentioned it in your introduction, May. Problem of accessibility to these kinds of trials that are taking place in faraway countries, in cities and courts that many people will have never heard of, far away from Syria, far away from the affected communities, potentially closer actually to a large diaspora community that is searching for justice and found this pathway, which I think is part of the part that is successful, that we can I think label as a success here. The podcast was from the beginning meant to be bilingual in Arabic, or in English and in Arabic, which was a no-brainer really, because part of the reason that it is such a complicated and really just a third best option to have these trials in these faraway countries and cities is that, like has already been mentioned, they're conducted in not just in a different language, in this case German, but really in a different cultural language, right? Let alone a different judicial language. And we try to at least help to bridge that gap a little bit, to provide the information in the different languages, to conduct some of the outreach that wasn't done by these courts that aren't specialized really in doing these international criminal trials. And that's how the whole idea started, and it was a side project on a shoestring budget, and became this larger thing. And I think sort of the lessons that I've taken from that, it's now 2 years ago that we started it. It's hugely complex. I mean, we saw from the beginning that language would be an issue, that outreach would be an issue, accessibility would be an issue, information, and all that. But really, it became clear quite quickly after the trial started that those were probably, next to witness protection and security issues, the most crucial shortcomings of this trial. And I think, was it not for the civil society organizations and some few, I think, media that did go to all the trial hearings and report on it, and including the Syrian groups that did that, that a lot would have been lost. And I think the success that it did become in many ways would have been less complete. Now, I think it's been pointed out that it can be seen as a success, despite all the shortcomings. I think that the court, the panel of 5 judges, really did a good job. I think this was a good and fair trial. Took almost 2 years, and was really a fair administration of equal justice, which to many of the Syrians that I've worked with over the past few years, and that we've talked to on the podcast, meant a lot, right? That it's this independent court of law that for the first time finally put out a concrete, tangible judgment. And in that sense alone, even though it is against 2 individuals that may not be the most responsible, it meant a lot, including what Leila said, that the court did go into the crimes against humanity element, and did look at the state crimes that were behind these individual perpetrators. So in that sense, I think we did see that a success was booked there, but also that it's definitely not enough. And there's many reasons, there's many levels to that. I think it would be illusionary to think that these regional courts can deliver perfect justice for these complex issues of crimes that are committed in faraway countries. That's not. I think improvements can and should be implemented for these kinds of trials of universal jurisdiction. But I think it would be an illusion to think that that would really take it to a level that would be completely satisfactory. That goes for these regional trials, but it even goes for trials at the International Criminal Court. They'll always be far away from where the crimes happened, and as such, they'll never be enough. Maybe just to sort of round up my initial input here. I think court-based justice, criminal justice, is exactly that and not more. It can never be a holistic, a complete justice, and that starts with the fact that what's being done in a courtroom is an attempt at finding a judicial truth, which is not the same as the actual truth, which, by the way, is not a thing that exists either. But it's an approach to it, to that, but it is only one part of a larger, wider attempt at justice in a society that has gone through incredible horrors, and as such, I think we shouldn't have too high expectations and illusions of what it can deliver. And I'm happy to talk about that more later on.
Thank you, Fritz. I'm going to jump into a second round of questions. A reminder to our audience that you can submit questions via the Q&A, and I will get to them after this round. I want to ask you each of you, some more sobering questions, as well as also begin to think about accountability outside of the courtroom, because we would be remiss if we had this conversation solely about what's going on in the courts when we have people in our midst like Khulud, who finds accountability in other forms, and when these crimes are also ongoing. They're not historic crimes, and I want to make that point and ask you to reflect on it as we approach these next set of questions. So Leila, I'm going to bring you back into the conversation, and I want to ask you, as we look to this next decade, what developments do you hope to see in the strategic litigation, criminal justice, or court-based justice space for Syria, and maybe even beyond? What needs to happen? What needs to change? You began talking a little bit about the shortcomings, but kind of looking ahead, now that we've had 11 years, kind of this next decade, if you will, or even beyond then, what would you want to see?
First of all, thank you for this challenging question. It's very interesting. But I'm going to start by saying, based on what Fritz was just saying, and what you were just saying, is that even courtroom proceedings should be led by, they should be Syrian-led, they should be survivor-centered, and that means that even the cases that we pursue and the shape that such proceedings need to take ideally would be informed, and what we do as legal practitioners would only be to facilitate that process. That put aside, and that's why I'm personally most interested in hearing from Khulud when it comes to this sort of questions. But I'm gonna go back to the more details about how the proceedings tend to go. So So I'm going to go back to the point that I made at the end of the last question, which is who gets to tell the story and access to justice proceedings and how we conduct investigations in practice. So there are two ways that we prioritize investigations. So either we pursue cases based on individual perpetrators that we have access to, who are currently based on European territory, and then we identify crimes and witnesses to make a case against them, or we identify specific cases and we hope that the investigation will eventually yield their jurisdictional link, which will then allow us to bring the case to a national prosecution authority. And there are cases that were submitted to national authorities using each of these methods. In practice, I think it's possible that although the first one has been the most commonly used so far for very practical reasons, it may be increasingly difficult to use as perpetrators start hearing about such cases and hopefully decide against coming to Europe. The second one, on the other hand, tends to take more time, more resources, but may enable us to address specific issues that are not primarily based on jurisdictional concerns. And I think, for instance, here of the case that was submitted recently, maybe 2 years ago, by civil society organizations such as SCM and the Syrian Archive and a few others on the use of chemical weapons, which is a very ambitious case, which took them, I think, 3 years to build, but if successful, could be of great significance. And in such cases, although jurisdiction is necessary for the case to be brought to court, the case isn't picked because of it, but because of its symbolic and political importance or potential impact. In our work, so I work in collaboration with a Syrian lawyer, Mariana Karkutli. And in our work, we tend to focus mostly on investigations on specific events, so the second one, and determine potential jurisdiction links at a later stage. And this approach has some political advantage to it in the sense that it enables us to prioritize pursuing certain cases in partnership with organizations and individuals which had been previously involved in local committees in Syria doing documentation work or media work, and were themselves witnesses to the crimes that we're investigating. And in that sense, it enables us to work in partnership with Syrian civil society organizations and decide together which cases to pursue. Also, being ourselves women, we're constantly mindful of ensuring that women are involved at every step of the process. And this is definitely something that we'd like to see more of in the future, because a lot of the early cases were developed by Syrian men-led organizations. And although they did a wonderful, much needed job, representation and access to justice requires more women to be involved and lead justice proceedings for many reasons. One of them is that at this stage, it's mostly crimes which are easier to investigate that are being pursued. So crimes which can more easily be linked to the perpetrator, as if, for instance, the case was torture within the context of detention. And these are mostly crimes that have statistically targeted the majority of men. And I think these are important points because I'm just going to dive here into some of the experiences that we've had during our investigative work, my colleague Mariana and I. And the first one was that at a certain point during the investigations, we're trying to identify and speak to women witnesses, and it became really evident to us that these testimonies may not have been possible had we not ourselves been women, either because some witnesses may not have agreed to talk to us, or that they may not have felt as comfortable sharing some of the aspects of their testimonies. And that's the aspect that worries me, that they may never have been identified and approached as potential witnesses. And during our investigative work, we would, initiate discussions with networks of local activists, we kept being referred to a lot of local activists, a majority of which were men. And when that happens, of course, we do speak to them, and they almost always have extremely valuable contributions to make to the investigation. However, one of the reasons that women are not as frequently referred to us seem to have something to do not with the relevance of their testimony, but with visibility. So visibility of the person and their perceived role in society, of the work they do, but also the visibility of the gender aspects of the crimes that we are investigating and their codification in law. In the current socio-political context, speaking to women witnesses relevant to the case is something that tends to require a conscious effort and that can be very easily overlooked. So that's one of the things that we'd definitely like to see more of in the future. When we talk about the importance of including women's perspectives, it's often in relation to sexual violence. And although this is an extremely important issue, I think it would be a mistake to limit the experience of women in conflict to sexual violence. There are different reasons why women may be targeted, specific ways in which they are targeted, and sometimes instrumentalized, and often less obviously visible ways in which some of the systematic crimes targeting a majority of men, like enforced disappearance and some of the violations taking place in detention, impact women differently. And sometimes in an indirect way that's not always codified in law, and that's enabled by pre-existing discriminatory domestic legal frameworks, which affect, for instance, one's rights under the family law framework, such as access to inheritance or ownership. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that we can't have a complete understanding of the scope of the use and the impact of the international crimes that we're investigating, whether intended or not, without taking into account women's perspectives, especially given how systematically women were instrumentalized for their role in society to achieve certain aims. And that won't happen unless more women are involved in the casework in every capacity. And here I mean investigator, legal practitioner, but I also mean experts, also mean witnesses, every possible way. The current use of universal jurisdiction represents the only existing avenue for criminal justice and a unique opportunity to involve regime officials and other perpetrators in criminal proceedings. And I understand that the resources are scarce and that we need to prioritize certain crimes on the basis that they are more systematic or easier to investigate. And that is exactly what has been happening in the process of selecting which cases to investigate and to submit. But in doing so, I think we also need to be mindful of not rendering invisible to justice proceedings and through them possible future reparation schemes, 50% of the population. And that entails making a conscious effort to include women in every stage of the legal proceedings in every capacity possible, to fund as many existing skilled Syrian women legal practitioners willing to be involved in these proceedings. And this is, for instance, part of the work that we're trying to do with our newly established organization, Hukiyat, which May mentioned at the start. I think this is also a point that we can make more generally about communities that may not constitute a majority. Diversity and representation in the cases being brought to court requires diversity, representation, and inclusion at every level of the investigation process. History has shown that one of the key gains from international tribunals is that of history writing. Legal decisions shape the narratives of the events. And that is what I personally find most crucial about the Koblenz trial and the structural investigation it led to. And because of the crucial role of that accountability proceedings play in narrative making, it makes it all the more important for the women and partners, such as victim groups, survivor groups, to be involved in the proceedings to render these proceedings as inclusive and meaningful as possible, and ensure that the impact these crimes had on their lives is recognized. And I say this, for example, in the context of regular discussions regarding possible refugee return, practical steps being taken in that direction, most notably by Denmark, with the opening of deportation camps, which can only take place if one imagines Syria as safe to return to. A narrative which is partially affected by our ability to show that a lot of us considers a source of the problems the Assad regime is the main source of the danger for Syrians, and that there can be no return for any Syrian refugee, whether man or woman, political activist or not, as long as the regime stays in place. And here, one last point I'd like to make in light of Russia's current invasion of Ukraine is that selective solidarity and selective accountability functions to let people like Assad or Putin get away with international crimes, which then enables them to repeat the same scenario elsewhere. Had we been able to react appropriately to bypass the Russian veto when this was and still is taking place in Syria, there is a chance that Putin would have been held accountable and wouldn't have been able to do what he's currently doing in Ukraine.
Thank you, Layla. Some very timely comments, and I appreciate your clear recommendations on and reflections on the gendered nature of all of this. And I think some clear recommendations for those who are listening on case selection as well. Muaz, I want to turn back to you. You're someone who does quite a bit of advocacy, and I'm sure you're seeing an alarming trend among some countries, among some businesses, among individuals, increasingly accepting or even normalizing the Syrian regime and in a way erasing the crimes that it spent the last decade plus committing and that it in fact continues to commit till this day. How do we keep calls for accountability alive amid this trend toward normalization? What should governments be doing? What should advocates be doing?
Well, I think, first of all, there has been it's been overwhelmingly inspirational, all of the amazing both witnesses and from the Syrian people in general that have seen this horrific war go on, and by the experts, not just my words, by people that have watched what's happening. It's the worst crimes of the 21st century. I think the number one thing to be done is to make it as public as possible, to let everyone know what's happening. And the Syrians don't lack the content in that. It's actually it's crazier than movies that people watch. It's wilder than any book that anyone can see. It's more horrific than any nightmare. What I've heard from witnesses, whether it's Omar al-Shugri, who also directs our detainee affairs at CTF, is just insane, and not just what's what's happened to him in prison, but also what's happened to his family in Al Baida at that massacre. We have in our organization, we try to post every anniversary of a massacre that happens in Syria just on social media, and every single day there is a massacre that's like, and I hate to compare anything to anything, but like a Kosovo market bombing or Srebrenica, we have multiple occasions of those. And these were the occasions that galvanized the world, not just to not normalize, but to act, to intervene, to protect people. Caesar has come to the United States more than 6 times. Like, this is someone who risked everything, went through all of this, got to Europe, talked to both the German prosecutors and other court cases, showed the people the pictures, and that wasn't enough, right? Like, even for someone who did all of this, he had to come here multiple times, and every time that we brought him, something was accomplished, because you sit him down with a member of Congress or you put him on media and people learn about this, and that's the pressure that's needed to stop this sort of normalization. We've been working in I give a lot of credit to the staff, not me, at SETF, that worked on this with the New York Times for about 6 months on an article that came out yesterday online, and today is in the paper, about mass graves in Syria. This is not a billion years ago. This is happening now. And these countries are not just erasing the crimes, they're endorsing continued crimes. It's like, yesterday, the gravedigger was also here, or that's the code name that he uses for lack of a better name. And he's one of the witnesses in the Koblenz trial. He's like on his 3rd day in the US, but yesterday he was being interviewed by a TV journalist for a program that will come out next week. And he was, he was saying that any country that normalizes with the Assad regime or thinks about it is literally like giving a medallion to the regime for the crimes that it's committed. And this is not just mass graves that happened before. These are mass graves that are still being dug now and used at another location after ones are filled up. So it's important to raise awareness, because the people of democratic countries move their governments, and that's why you want the widest audience possible. But in terms specifically of, what can countries, and the United States as my country, do about normalization? Well, a couple of things. First of all, the Caesar Act was a huge success in stopping that, right? Because what the Assad regime was doing was giving lucrative construction contracts to countries to build on homes that were destroyed, whose people were displaced, to reconstruct these homes to give, his loyalists or whatever, or Iranians or whoever he brings. And in exchange, he would get diplomatic recognition from some of these countries. And we've seen Bahrain or UAE or other countries in the Arab world, surprisingly, the Kingdom of Jordan, the king called Bashar. That is unbelievable. That should be as shocking to us as someone considering calling Hitler in 1945 and saying, they want to see if he can come back into the community of nations. So the United States must do a couple of things. Number one, and this is being worked on, a revision of the Caesar Act. So the act that's already in place, but now not just to strengthen its punishment of anyone that works with the regime, including countries that would normalize with it, but also ensuring that no administration can find a loophole around that, even an American administration. But number two, the US, whether it's Congress, if the administration believes that this conflict is at its lowest violence levels and doesn't want to deal with it right now for whatever reason, then the Congress must pass legislation that not just calls out normalization, but punishes it. A country that normalizes with the Assad regime should never receive US funding. And a country that normalizes with the Assad regime that maybe wants military aircraft should have any military aid reviewed. Because if a country is normalizing with this sort of regime, we should never give it weapons, much less money. And these measures needs to, are things that can move forward. And that's something that I know in his meetings, the gravedigger has sort of reiterated, and I know that people are just right now shocked when they just listen to someone who witnessed for 7 years mass graves, thousands and thousands of bodies being buried every single month. And finally, it is a shame it's on their legacy forever. Any country that ever even considered normalizing with Assad, and that needs to be reiterated. The public cost, the political cost, the diplomatic and economic costs of normalization need to be much, much heavier. And that's, I think, the direction we're going in. So I'm actually optimistic, despite a few countries that should be ashamed of themselves.
Thanks, Moaz. Some strong recommendations, which I imagine will be cause for discussion in the Q&A. But I just want to ask you a quick follow-up, Moaz. Are there recommendations you have specific to accountability, whether it's on laws that allow for jurisdiction or funding or what have you, kind of about accountability specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll mention a couple of examples. There's a piece of legislation sort of that's been moving a little bit in being worked on, and a lot of people deserve credit on this. So I won't name them all, so in case I miss someone. But we have, for example, the idea of being able to have a law that allows for, let's say you're not let's say you're Syrian in Syria, you get arrested and detained and tortured. We know a specific person that went through this, comes to the United States, then becomes an American citizen, right? He couldn't sue or she directly couldn't sue for retroact or what had happened to them before they were American citizens. Well, this law would allow that to happen. That opens more doors, and with Syrian refugees being everywhere, especially in the United States, that's somewhere that's important. The other I think, important piece of legislation that's been kind of worked on and changed a little bit, and some really amazing people have been working on pushing it. Is a piece of legislation that's been authored before by Senator Durbin, but really hasn't moved because it hasn't had sort of a Republican on board and so on. But I think with Ukraine and with what's happening in Syria, I'm sorry, with the mass graves now and so on, which is getting a lot of attention here. I think that's going to open the opportunity to sort of get a bipartisan support for legislation, which is essentially broadening on a much bigger scope, sort of the jurisdiction of the United States in terms of going after crimes against humanity and so on here. So those are two specific examples. There was one thing I wanted to add also related to this, but it's slipping my mind. But anyway, if I remember
it's
it,
okay. I'll come back to you.
I hope I answered the question.
No, that was great. And those are some very specific examples, because while our audience is not solely American, there are Americans in the room and government and decision makers. So it's helpful to have specific recommendations. Thanks for that. Fritz, via your work on the podcast, but also in light of your experience with accountability, not only for Syrians, but other contexts as well, what have you learned about what court-based criminal justice can and cannot deliver? And accordingly, are there other forms of accountability and justice-seeking measures that you think are important for us to be investing in and supporting?
Thanks, May. I want to start answering your question by picking up on something that Muaz just said and that Leila also touched on, right? Is this incredibly terrible moment in time that people refer to as normalization of the Assad regime, right? And how the judgment in the Koblenz case that we did that podcast on, I think came in a really timely moment, in the sense of also how law and politics talk to each other. It is much harder for any government or any institution, for that matter, to ignore what the Assad regime has done and is doing now that first ever criminal court judgment is out. That's literally on paper. The first one in the first of the two cases in that trial has just been published, I think, yesterday or the day before. Second one will also come out later this year. That means that there's something tangible there that can be shown to these governments, reminding them who they are engaging with and how wrong that is. And Leila was mentioning, the value and the way that court-based justice can contribute to history writing. This too is something where we've seen a lot of shortcomings in this Koblenz trial, in the sense of looking at the judgment, which will be out there for future generations to study. That is pretty much the only sort of written product that the court itself has produced, which is, for a lot of international followers of trials and justice procedures, absolutely unfathomable. There are no transcripts of the court hearings. There were no, let alone live streams of the sessions that people that weren't able to come to Germany could tune into. People that were able to come to Germany that couldn't speak German, but for example, just only Arabic, or they didn't have the right to access the simultaneous translation that was available for the trial parties. So all of those really really worrisome shortcomings have been efforts have been made to help some of those shortcomings. Again, civil society organizations, many Syrian groups have done trial reports and have published them on their websites. And us too at the podcast, both in Arabic and English, we've published all of the transcripts of our episodes on the website as well for people now to read up on, but also for future generations. I think this is a huge effort by civil society, but that is definitely part of the success. Now, I think your question wasn't about success anymore, but rather about what court-based justice can't deliver and what potential alternatives are. Just quickly to take a step back at what we mean when we say court-based justice, right? We've been discussing here today the Koblenz trial, which was a sort of national regional trial dealing with international crimes in Syria. Then you have, of course, the idea of special tribunals and the International Criminal Court, which have much more resources and capacities to actually provide stuff that I just mentioned: transcripts, live streams, access to translation in the visitors gallery. So that's great, but both of those options are not enough, are flawed, right? Starting with the geography. I mean, the International Criminal Court is in The Hague, or Koblenz. Same thing, way too far away from any affected communities, Syrian or other. So, in that sense, it is always flawed, and it always will be, as long as justice in Syria for Syrians isn't possible. These are just second or third best options, and that is something we'll just have to live with, which has invited a lot of innovation as well in this space, and has produced quite some remarkable work. I've already mentioned the civil society organizations, the Syrian groups, but what I also wanted to mention, going into the question of what court-based justice and why it cannot ever be enough and complete. Taking a little step back here now, as a German, I have German heritage, partly Swiss heritage. I'm married to a Dutch. My son was born in France. I don't really have anything with national identity, but I did grow up in Germany, and growing up there, I have often wondered, what is in fact a appropriate reaction to horrors such as the Second World War and the Holocaust, those kinds of incomprehensible crimes. Well, criminal justice isn't the full answer. I mean, you had the Nuremberg trials. Later on, you had the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt, which came way too late in the 60s. They're still trying to put certain very, very old people on trial that worked in concentration camps, and that's important, and it should be done. It's part of why I do this job, but it's not enough. It wasn't enough for Germany. I mean, the sociological, the cultural work that had to be done within society to work through these horrors and what it meant for the people and for the international community was definitely much larger than criminal justice. Now, making a bit more concrete, looking at the Syria work that many of us have done in different capacities. Leila already touched on that just now as well from her own practical experience. One point I wanted to make is criminal justice isn't for everyone either. It's not just that it isn't enough, generally speaking, but it isn't for everyone. A lot of people that may have witnessed very major crimes or have information on those crimes that would be extremely valuable to build a case and bring that case and submit a complaint, potentially because you even know that, as Leila said, there's a perpetrator available for arrest. But that person, it just doesn't feel it. It says this kind of justice isn't for me, just because for practical reasons I'm not going to invest all those emotions, re-traumatization, invest years of my life. I mean, building the case and then going to trial. It is going to be 2, 3, 4, 5+ years of my life. I have other priorities. I have family. I have kids. This is not what I want to spend a good chunk of my future life on. And then another aspect of that, of sort of personal way of the question that justice isn't for everyone and is very subjective is, is some people would say and would have a good argument saying, criminal justice is based on, in large part, a punitive character of justice, vindicative, right? And I don't believe in that. Some people will say, I don't believe in that. I don't believe that we should be punishing people like Anwar R and Iyad A. There is evening filling discussions to be had whether these two accused were a fitting duo to be accused in the worldwide first criminal trial against former Syrian regime officials, right? And so when those people say, this is not for me, plus it's hugely selective, there's many double standards at work. In our space now, there's a huge discussion about very quickly putting together a special tribunal for the aggression that Russia is showing against Ukraine and for that illegal invasion. And then some people are saying, where is that tribunal for the illegal invasion of Iraq? Putting on trial the former leaders of the United States, United Kingdom, and the Allies. Like, nobody's talking about that. So I understand when people say, this criminal justice isn't for me, and I'm not going to participate in that. As sometimes as difficult it is to accept that when you want to build a case, I think that is important to recognize. Just to finish answering your question, May, and it's a bit of a leap, right? But I want to bring this up because I think it's important when we answer the question of why is criminal justice never enough, and what else is out there. Of course you have all the rest, right? Politics, negotiations, diplomacy, military strikes is a form of accountability in certain worlds, and then you have truth commissions. You have great initiatives by civil society that Khulud was also speaking about, and that a lot of survivor families have kicked off in recent years, it goes as far as political amnesties and stuff like that. That's all happening. Those are all options. Many of them controversial. Sanctions, hugely controversial again right now. But I want to just end on mentioning one that I think is often overlooked, but can be really beneficial to people trying to work through what justice means for them, and that is the arts. I think in the world of arts, there's a lot of interesting initiatives happening, including with regard to Syria, where people get to participate in an alternative form of justice, namely in being part of artistic innovations. There was a very interesting, people should look it up after this session, sculpture park by a or art installation by a Syrian artist in front of the Koblenz court. As the sessions were going on, people could see through the windows these faceless statues that he had erected. That certainly had an impact on everybody there. There are theater pieces that include survivors who are working through their experience and their stories and their traumas in an artistic way through theater, rather than becoming a witness and entering this tedious and often very difficult experience of being a criminal justice participant. And then there's the interesting tool of people's tribunals, where a mix of actors and real life judges and lawyers and prosecutors come together and enact a tribunal for crimes where official impunity is an issue. Those are all, I think, initiatives that allow people to work through a kind of justice, to find out what it means for them to look for some sort of justice and healing that doesn't put them through the often very, very painful experience of criminal justice. And I think that's worth really looking out for and supporting as an alternative to all the other alternatives that are out there.
Thank you, Fritz. I want to bring Khulud in for one final question before we turn to the many audience questions we've been receiving. And Khulud, please take your time with this. We want to hear from you about this critical issue. Across everything we've spoken about so far, the role of survivors and victims has been absolutely essential. We would not be here without their bravery and just the remarkable contributions they've had. Can you tell us more about how survivors and victims have organized over the last 11 years, what they've accomplished, and what needs to be done to ensure that their voices, their needs, their vision is the one that is rightly driving the Syria accountability conversation?
Yeah, thank you very much, May. First of all, if I want to go back to the history of how they organized themselves during the past 11 years, is that at the beginning of the Syrian revolution, when we started to see like our friends and families and beloved ones are being detained by the regime, local people started to organize themselves in having to, let's say, like small documentation units or like cells, if I may call them. And they were affiliated to the activists group in each and every city. But then in 2012, we started to have like a wider scale of accountability documentation organizations, where they started to collect data from different cities and different activists. But then it developed more and more when we started to have, like, as it is the case now, where we have like very professional organizations working on documentation, accountability, and justice in Syria. But then the families of the detainees or the disappeared or the survivors themselves, they started to gather themselves together, as I think I can recall that back to like very small initiatives started after 2016, 2017, when they started to see themselves like, we've never been asked in any conference or in any gathering, what is our opinion, how we see the solution, why we are not part of any negotiations, why we are pushed away from any political discussion regarding any foreseen solution for Syria. And then they started to gather themselves together, and we started to have small organizations of families of the detainees and the disappeared. Now we have like many groups of them. Like now I am a member of Families for Freedom, which is now the efforts of them is that they lobby, they advocate for the case of the detainees. They meet people in governments, like, or in the United Nations or in the Security Council. They are vocal. They have been everywhere. They've been speaking up for themselves and for their family members who have been lost for the past 11 or 10 years. But I mean, and then in the end, they gathered also together and they created a charter for justice and truth. 5 organizations, they created that charter. But beyond that, personally speaking, if you ask me, where are we now? We are nowhere. Have we achieved any part of justice? We've never reached any level of achieving any kind of justice. We are only in the level of lobbying, advocating, and speaking up. Like I describe this by we're still shouting. We're still just like using microphones for others to hear us, to hear our story, but no actions have been taken by the big players, if I call them, by the international community, to put any measures against the Syrian regime so far, or any other perpetrators. We're not calling for the atrocities committed by the regime, but also any other people who are detained or like tortured by any other armed groups in Syria. But I mean, for us, the major perpetrator is the Assad regime, and we are calling for justice in this regard. How successful have we been? I think everyone knows that there are detainees in Syria, and there are people who are calling for the justice and the accountability for the Syrian people. Who is listening to us? I don't know. Who is taking any further action for this? Also, I don't know. If anything is going to be taken by any big players, it's always in the back of their lists or agendas. There's always something major to think about, whether it's the geography of it, or it's the color of the people who are defending them. It's fairer, or they look nicer than us. It's always on the top of their tables that they have something more important to deal with rather than the Syrian issue. And unfortunately, I've seen a couple of questions like, have the civil war ended in Syria? And this is, personally, it irritates me. It's not a civil war. It started like an uprising, a revolution for peaceful demonstrators who called for democracy and change. And they don't want a dictator regime to be ruling them. And that was the call in 2011. And then afterwards, the big players turned it into a war. It's not a civil war. It's our army who participated in killing us. It's my government who killed me. It's not me who went to the government and killed them, you know? So it's, I'm sorry if I am angry, but it irritates me to see that question. Has the civil war ended? No, it's never ending, because we are not fighting each other. It's the regime who is still ruling, who's still the civil face for the Syrians, is still in power, who's still promoted by other nations. That, what do you want? The extremists or the Assad regime, the civil guy with blue eyes who got educated in, who was educated in the United Kingdom, and he is the civilian, the civil face ruling Syria, or you want these terrorists ruling Syria? So we, after 11 years, we are still facing that question, whom you are supporting. Are we going to go back to the Assad regime, who's still committing crimes against humanity up till this moment? So it's not a civil war. It's not a call for ending the war in Syria, because no one is fighting the Syrian. I mean, it's not a war between two countries. It's a war launched and waged by the Syrian regime against the people. So I don't know when it's going to end. It will end only when the international community will be serious, when they have the will, the political will, to have an end and to lay aside the ruling regime inside Syria. And I have never seen this seriousness in the past 11 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Khulud. Very sobering reflection, but a fair one. And I think part of justice, in my sense at least, and part of this conversation is you deciding and determining the narrative. So thank you for raising civil war versus revolution versus uprising. I think at least the minimum is document and center and tell the Syrian story from the Syrian vantage point. So I want to turn to a question from the audience, which I know all of the speakers were expecting, and whoever wants to jump in can. This is a big moment for the international community. We've seen the international community come together around the Russian invasion into Ukraine, and there have been certain measures taken in the international legal and accountability space already. What do Syrian civil society organizations or those advocating for Syria make of this? How can we ensure that galvanization of the international community applies to the Syrian case? I know this is a sensitive question and a difficult one, but I want to invite anyone who feels comfortable to do so. Muaz, I see you first, and then whoever else wants to join.
Sure, thank you, May. I think in here you're talking in terms of what's going on in Ukraine and how that relates to Syria in terms of the overall picture, right? And what people in the international community are watching. And if that's the case, number one, like nobody more than the Syrian people understands what the Ukrainians are going through right now. And nobody more than the Syrian people understand of the horrors to come in Ukraine as this grinds on, more than the Syrian people. And what I think is important is that everyone should be applauding the international community and anyone that stood up in solidarity with Ukraine. This is not the time to be like, well, you paid attention to Ukraine, but not to the Rohingya or something else. That doesn't matter. When people stand up for the right thing, that should be galvanized, because that's on behalf of all these victims. Because by the way, the criminals are also all the same. In Syria, it's just intricately tied. If Russia wasn't allowed for 7 years to by its own admission, test over 200 weapons in Syria, do all of these crimes, it wouldn't be doing what it's doing in Ukraine today. Yesterday in Congress, we had multiple members from the House, multiple members of Congress from both Republicans and Democrats, speaking. But we also in the audience on March 15th, the Syria event, we were very proud to have Ukrainian representatives in the audience and listened to a powerful video coming to us from one of our friends in our network on the ground in Ukraine, of this doctor who heads all of the sort of medical hospitals and stuff for the Ukrainian government in and around Odessa. And And it was such a powerful story. You know, he discussed how the mosques of Aleppo and the churches of Kiev are just as important to, you know, to the world. And he discussed how the mother dying with her little daughter in Damascus, and the one that gets killed in Kharkiv, or are also the same pain under the same criminal. He discusses a bakery in Sarakib, in another store in Mariupol, and to hear him say it while he's getting ready for the sirens to blare, so he and his little daughter can go, in their basement. It's the same thing. And so what is powerful has been, and for the last 9 days, I've spent a ton of time with people in Ukraine working on war crimes documentation, first responders in the medical field, and the resistance against the Russians that have, we've tried to connect to the Syrians that are on the ground, and those that are working in this field. And it's so powerful because, first of all, the Syrians give them the best advice. They start off by saying, don't count on the United States, don't count on the international community, don't count, even though we have some solidarity, some good steps, but not near enough, because they're bombing hospitals now in Ukraine, and we're letting it go. But then they tell them, now that you know that, you can resist, you can be resilient. We've done it for 7 years. We've seen you so bravely do it for 7 or 9 or however many days, and we've seen your leadership that is so courageous. And then we start talking about the details, and here is where it's beautiful. I've listened to people from the White Helmets tell first responders in Ukraine about the tactics of how Russians bomb, and for civil defense and first responders, how do you do it? Be in smaller units, smaller flexible cars, don't have major headquarters, use shortwave walkie-talkies, not your phones, not long wave ones, so they're not intercepted. Know that you've got about 7 to 8 minutes if the Russians try to do the double tap, to go in, get out less than 7 minutes, wait, and then come back again. All these things that are incredibly powerful, and the importance of the GoPro camera, right? That is not just to raise awareness, but to document war crimes, but all of these things that are happening. SAMS, I've talked to the president of SAMS and others this is the Syrian American. Can these just doctors to have so many countries and doctors are doing, somebody can come from the UK or somewhere else to try to help, and they wouldn't know how to operate in a war zone. But a Syrian doctor that worked in Aleppo, he's there to not just help medically, but advice on how do you operate that in a place like this. And when it comes to war crimes documentation, and accountability, what Syrians have done, all the organizations, all the activists, and most importantly, these key survivors and witnesses, whether it's Omar or Caesar or the Gravedigger, all of these people, civil society organizations and law firms, have helped evolve international law when we don't even have the ICC, and connected to all of these key law firms, the creation of the IIIM, stuff like that, that's helped, despite all the blockages, pursue accountability and move things forward, even get convictions. And that is also very relevant information for the Ukrainians. They do have an ICC investigation going, but other things, and how do you document these crimes in the right way? So
I'm going to just cut you off, just because we only have 10 minutes and we have so many questions. Let's keep all of our answers to these questions a minute or two. That way everyone can engage. Does anyone want to weigh in very quickly on anything else related to the Ukraine and Syria? If not, we can.
I just want to say, May, yes, I do want to weigh in, and there's so much to say, but I think we should move on, and we'll meet again to discuss the question that was just very vividly, I think, started bringing up. But I think we should also look at other questions here.
Sure. I want to turn to another question. What do you make of the implicit recognition of some European states to send refugees back to Syria? This question of refugee return, how does it affect the accountability question, and what's being done about it? Khulud, do you wanna take this?
Yeah, thank you very much. So first of all, is one of the things that is doing harm to the Syrian people is that recognizing Syria as a safe place so they can return the refugees back to Syria, which is, one, it's not safe to return the refugees back to Syria, because I mean, most of those who were returned back to Syria, they've been detained by the regime and they disappeared, and we don't know their whereabouts. Second, now we have something in Syria that has been the norm for the past 2 years, where they abduct people, they take them, they hide them, and then they ask for ransoms. And most of the people, the perpetrators, if you ask people, then they have like some players in the regime or in the government playing role or a major role in that, which means that they need the money to fund themselves. So they are using that as a double, a double weapon. But on the other side, if we have witnesses to the crimes of the Syrian regime now, and we have access to them in Europe, safe and sound, we're sending them back to Syria, and we lose access to them, and maybe they will be either killed or impacted or silenced. At least if they will be safe, they will be silenced, and they will never get the chance to speak up or to give their witnesses against the crimes committed by the regime or the things that they have seen. So we are losing on both sides. And the thing is that Syria is not safe. If you're sent refugees back to the country, they will be under a high risk of being tortured or detained by the regime, and we are losing in the level of accountability and justice.
Thank you, Khulud. I want to turn to a question that we've received about the amount of misinformation and disinformation being spread about Syria, about accountability, about Assad, including from pro-Assad personalities, from Russian trolls, etc. This plays a big part in how public opinion is perceived and shaped. What do we do about it? Fritz, do you have thoughts on this?
It's really hard because it's so powerful and it's so hard to stop. Especially when you start thinking about how these things often occur in sort of echo chambers where people are just not open anymore to receiving critical information and information that doesn't sort of accord to their set of beliefs. One thing I think that concretely is being done about it and has been done also in Syria in the past few years, and now again in the Ukraine situation, is the verification of especially audiovisual material, of photos and of videos by groups such as Syrian Archive and Bellingcat and their local partner organizations on the ground. That is so crucial. Fake audiovisual material has skyrocketed. The amount of it has skyrocketed in past years. The ways of creating fake videos and fake photos, the technological access to that kind of stuff has become much easier. And so the work that is being done in verifying and making sure that the audiovisual material that is being shared is somehow marked as well before it goes to media outlets, before it goes on social media. The role that social media channels and companies play in this, in filtering fake content. I mean, again, this is an evening-filling topic of discussion. The good news is that there is concrete and really good work being done about it, but I think the reality is also that it's a huge challenge.
And lots of responsibility on the part of businesses, social media platforms, but also others as well who are paying attention to the misinformation, disinformation space. Leila, there are a couple of very legal questions that I want to see if you want to hop in on. There's a question about the destruction of forensic evidence, taking into account these mass graves that are being discovered and sort of what we make of what international law says about this, but also how we can build on the discovery of these mass graves and others in the legal process. And there's also another question about the information that governments have. There's quite a lot of information, perhaps some of it classified, that governments have that may be relevant to war crimes prosecutions. Have you seen any positive steps or action-oriented steps taken by decision makers toward facilitating these investigations? Do governments know what they need technically in order to support these investigations?
Okay, thank you. These are both really important questions. I'm not sure how well I can answer them, but I think the first one, so the one on the destruction of forensic evidence, I think it's a bit of a lot of us would like to think that the information exists somewhere and all we have to do is find it and preserve it, and this will be the truth, and then this would be used in legal proceedings. And I think that's a misconception on, I mean, obviously I just think that it's the reality of this kind of events, that this kind of evidence is part of the event itself, and that it tends to be destroyed. And a lot of it, so even like a lot of the documentation, let alone, bigger events such as mass graves, but even just the documentation, we had lots of local organizations, local committees on the ground since 2011 that were doing documentation on the ground. And because what's happening at the moment, the justice proceedings, very low level, but what's happening at the moment is happening 10 years later. And that means that a lot of the documentation that existed back in 2011 and maybe even still existed in 2014 may not exist anymore at the moment for, multiple reasons. Maybe the people lost, they were stored on hard drives, they were stored on SD cards, maybe these were lost, maybe these were broken, maybe the regime took over the specific area and kept all the documents, the physical documents, while people had to flee. And I think that at least the way I see it is that we shouldn't be thinking about all the evidence that we can't use, because it's lost about the evidence that we can actually use to build the case that we want to build. And because of the nature of the crimes that we're looking into at the moment, the strongest kind of evidence that we can possibly bring is witness testimonies. And that is also most important on a human level. So that was the first question on forensic evidence. And I think that relates to the information that governments have. I'm still a bit unsure on what kind of, I think Muaz might know better than I do, what kind of information the governments actually have. From my experience, as a civil society organization working in collaboration or aiming to collaborate with national prosecution authorities, what's been happening is that we don't have access to any of the information that they have. The only thing that we can do is when we have something that may be of interest to them, we get in touch with them and we say, here's something that you may be interested in. And they may or may not respond to that request. And sometimes when they do respond, they do appear to have information that is correlating the information that we have. Sometimes they don't have that information at all. And sometimes they are looking into cases that we did not expect them to be looking in at all. So on my side, I'm still very unclear on how much information they actually have. But I do think that one important point to make here is that a lot of people who work at the level of grassroots and civil society have access to a network of people. And it is these people who will constitute the core of the case in the end. And these are people that the governments tend to not have access to, in part because a lot of the governments who are looking into these cases tend to prioritize people who are already based in Europe for a lot of practical reasons. But when you work at the level of civil society, you can speak to someone who's based literally anywhere, with maybe the exception of Syria. Yes, maybe I'll leave it at this.
Thank you, Leila. And we're just about out of time, but I want to give everyone literally 30 seconds, no more than a minute, to leave the audience with closing thoughts. In our audience, we have journalists, we have US and other government officials, we have folks from the UN, and we have other civil society advocates. Whether you pick one group of those or all, what would you want our audience to leave this conversation either knowing or calling on them to do? We'll start with Khulud, and then Fritz, Muaz, and Leila.
Thank you, May. I don't know what to ask them to do, to be honest. It's just like we've been waiting for them to act for the past 11 years as like big players in the international community. But what I still call for is that please be serious in tackling the Syrian accountability file, because we really need to end all the atrocities. I mean, to stop having all these atrocities getting back to the Syrian people, and then to start to become really serious in sending Assad to accountability and all perpetrators in Syria. And this will never happen if they don't have the will and the determination. Just like we need them to start now to be serious. We only need seriousness in this file. I know it's very complicated for them. It's politically complicated, but we need to have actions. We don't need to hear from them like we do support you, we are beside you. I know that they are beside us, they support us, but 11 years now, we need action more than words. Thank you.
Fritz?
Yeah, let me just pick up on that and make two quick points. I think what Khulud is saying here again is to me also the biggest tragedy and heartbreaking element of the past 11 years, which is that the international community with the United Nations as the face of it has completely failed. This is unacceptable, and I think if nobody had understood it so far with now the Russian invasion in Ukraine, I think we have to accept that the system is completely out of date, talking about the United Nations here, and needs either a complete overhaul or needs to just be broken down and rebuilt in a different way. That is my sort of pessimistic and yeah, really sad point that I wanna just leave everyone with. The optimistic one though is that since that has been the case, there has been really an unprecedented development in the justice and accountability field in terms of case building, in terms of civil society participation in case building, including very innovative new instruments and tools. And just as a final point and an illustration of this, the amount of communication, correspondence, and exchange of information, and picking up on what Leila said last, between civil society organizations and investigating authorities and other international organizations today is exponentially bigger than it was 11 years ago, and that, I think that's a hopeful part in all of this tragedy.
Thank you, Muaz. Thank you, Fritz. Muaz, on to you.
Thanks, May. Thanks again for including me in this panel, and I learned a lot. And I wanted to say, for those that are in the audience that are not reporters or in the policy and are just listening, thank you for being on, for caring, and whatever it is that you enjoy doing, that you're good at, that you have passion about, whether it is art or video making or reporting or documenting. Use that to help end the never again moment in Syria. And if you don't know how you can help, reach out to us at the Syrian Emergency Task Force and join these different efforts that are helping. For the journalists, thanks for covering this. There's nothing more important. These are the worst crimes of the 21st century. The Syrians are the most displaced people in the world. Hundreds of thousands are in these prisons still. In Idlib, they're still in danger of the restart of a full offensive, which they breach the ceasefire there all the time. But for the policymakers in the United States, my country, or anywhere else, there is a young man who numbered dead bodies, including his own family members, and by a miracle survived after being in Saydnaya and being in Branch 215, and whose entire village was like ethnically cleansed by the Assad regime and Iranian militias. He's available for you to meet at any point to discuss practical steps forward, minus condemning or telling him you're sorry about what happened. In terms of the guy who took photographs of from 2011 to 2013 of almost 55,000 photos, he's available to meet at any time, not just to show you what he did, as you all have seen, and some of you have met him before, but to remind you that even through his own network, he can tell you that photography and that processing is still going on. There is today here in Washington, the gravedigger, who I'll take and should be meeting with the highest level officials, whether it's the Secretary of State or the President himself. No one should laugh at that. That's who should meet him, because he is witness to mass graves and the hundreds of thousands of bodies. And he has information that shows that at the next mass grave location that he would have worked at if he didn't come to Germany in 2018 is being dug right now, and humans are being buried there, including potentially American and European and other citizens if their lives are more important. And so he's available to talk at any time. The fact is that it is not the lowest levels of violence in Syria. It's only going to get worse. And if we don't care about Syria, care about Ukraine. That's a result of the inaction in Syria. And if we don't care about Ukraine, care about the next country, because that will be the result of the inaction both in Syria and Ukraine. And thank you again for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Maaz. And last but not least, Layla, close us off.
Thank you, May, and thank you, everyone. I'm going to start by just reporting what has been said so far, which is ideally what we want is a political transition, and I don't think any meaningful change can happen until that happens. Now, that being said, that's been going on for 11 years, and we need you to bear with us. And as long as it keeps happening, we need to keep the funding up, we need to keep the attention up, and that's for the policymakers, for the journalists, for everyone involved, because this will not change for some time for now. Sorry, I'm a bit pessimistic at the end of this talk. I have a few recommendations when it comes to the accountability processes. So I think what we'd like to see more of is diversity and financial support in civil society organizations working on strategic litigations. Would like to see more countries implementing and utilizing universal jurisdiction, and we'd like to see more resources directed towards it. And most importantly, and in light of the Al-Khatib trial and what Fritz said earlier in the conversation, and that's a whole new topic, but we would like to see solutions to the severe witness protections issues that we're facing with this regime still in place while we're working on these ongoing cases.
Thank you, Layla, and thank you all. We've clearly just scratched the surface. There's so much to talk about here. And certainly we've had a very sobering conversation, but at the same time, I'm humbled to be in your company and just to learn about the ongoing efforts that will continue, even if the international community looks away, although it shouldn't. And with that, I'll turn it back to Audrey. Thank you all.
Sincerely, from all of us at Time Up, thank you so much, Khulud, Layla, Fritz, and Muaz for sharing your insights on all of this. And thank you, May, for expertly guiding this conversation. It's definitely been an important and illuminating one. I'd like to just emphasize to everyone that today's event is part of a larger effort by Time Up to program around Syria and around issues of justice and accountability at large in the MENA region. We certainly invite you to continue to follow our work on these issues, as well as the work of each of our excellent panelists here who you've heard speak today. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us and for contributing so much to the discussion. These conversations are made far richer by your participation. And you can follow us on Twitter at TimeUpDC and also find where to follow each of our esteemed speakers. You can reach out for any media requests at press@timeup.org. And you can find a full recording of this discussion on our website and on our YouTube channel. Thank you all for joining and have a wonderful day, everyone.